Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
City Hall reporter Dylan McInnes,
business editor Greg Jefferson,
investigative reporter Brian Chasnoff.
And Dylan, I think in the past week we've seen, I think the expression would be the chickens coming home to roost over proposition. We had 2 out of 3 propositions pushed by the San Antonio Firefighters Union passed last November. And last week we saw one of them come into play. What happened?
Yeah, that's right. So one of the amendments that the Fire Union won last November gave them the unilateral right to declare an impasse in their contract negotiations with the city. They've been in a stalemate with the city since 2014 over a collective bargaining agreement. This gave them kind of an added leverage in those discussions. So they ended up meeting 19 times since February, 10 times in public, 9 times in private secret kind of mediation behind
not getting anywhere close to a deal in that time.
Not getting anywhere close to a deal. Basically, the Fire Union wants their kind of primary goal is a independent healthcare trust. So they would take all the money that the city currently uses to give them health insurance and manage it themselves, so that they can pull the levers of premiums and benefits and do all those things themselves outside of the city's purview. And they also asked for, I think, 27.5% in increased compensation increases, in part to make up for the 4-year pay freeze they've seen since their last deal expired. The city pitched a much different version. Their version kind of hewed to what the police got in 2016. Yeah. It was a 2% lump sum bonus in healthcare, similar to what police got. And so when you look at those 2 proposals, and neither of them really varied from those in the public meetings, at least we don't know what happened in mediation. They're hundreds of millions of dollars apart, and it didn't seem like they were going to be able to bridge that gap. So what the union did was trigger Prop C, and that sends the process into binding arbitration. So now they'll each pick one arbitrator. Those 2 arbitrators will pick a third one, and then they'll basically, it's kind of like a court setting almost. It's, they present their arguments, they present their evidence, and then those 3 arbitrators will come up with a deal that both have to live with.
Is there any timeline? I mean, this could go on for a few months. Is that right? Or?
Yeah, so there's some rigid timelines from the proposition in the city charter. So the process, they each have to name their arbitrator within 15 days. Okay. The process has to begin within 45 days. Once the process starts, there's 20 days for hearings. Where there's kind of confusion about the deadline is whether or not there's a deadline for the arbitrators to actually make a deal. Obviously, this is a complex document that would take a long time. But it does seem like, this 5-year-long stalemate is going to come to an end at some point in the next few months. When exactly in the next few months is...
And I think the assumption has been, I'm sure the firefighters in wanting that proposition to pass, the assumption was that this process would be beneficial to them, but we really don't know that.
Yeah.
Right?
I think maybe, perhaps what they were shooting for was just this leverage of threatening, being able to threaten using it would maybe give them more leverage in the actual negotiations. But once you get to arbitration, you both have to accept it. So, just as the arbitrators can come back and say, you get your own healthcare trust and you get 27.5% increases, which the city would have to live with. Yeah. They can come back and say, you get a 2% bonus and you don't get your own healthcare trust and you have to live with that now.
Now, I know in terms of police officers who seek their jobs back after they've been indefinitely suspended, arbitrators often rule more often in favor of the officers getting their jobs back. Do you have the sense that in this sort of scenario that arbitrators are more skewed toward the fire union?
I don't. So this is the first time that the city, at least the city officials can remember, a collective bargaining agreement being ironed out in binding arbitration. So I don't think there's a lot of precedent to be able to say, they usually hew towards the city or they usually hew towards the union. And I think this idea that they each pick one and those 2 are supposed to agree on a third, that kind of, I think the objective of that obviously is to balance the playing field, but it's unclear at this point kind of if it advantages one side or the other.
Right. So the big sticking point is the healthcare trust fund, basically?
It's the healthcare trust fund.
So what's the city's objection to that?
The city's objection to that is that, so if you look at self-controlled healthcare trusts across the country, the city argues that they often fail, that they're prone to, mismanagement or worse, malfeasance in terms of these millions of dollars that you're giving to control benefits. That if the union were to mismanage their trust to fail, the city would still be on the hook to end up bailing them out.
Yeah, so
the idea is that,
they want to have control over it.
They're putting up the money, they want to have control over that money.
Sure. Well, at long last, we will have some kind of resolution to this. So It's something we're going to be watching for. At this point, I want to introduce our special guest. We are so happy to be joined by State Representative Ina Minjarez. She's the representative for House District 124 in 2017, which was her first full term in the Texas House. She was selected Rookie of the Year by Texas Monthly, and she's on the committees overseeing appropriations, land and resource management, and redistricting. Did I miss any? Are those the?
Those are it.
Those are it.
Those are it.
Ina Minjarez, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, gentlemen, for having me. Good to see you.
We were talking just a few minutes ago. You've had about a month or so since the session ended. Have you had a chance to rest a little bit?
Just a little bit. It was time for me to just read some books I want to read, take my mind off the legislature for a little bit, exercise again because come March I had no time to do that, and just get reacquainted with my family. So it's good to be back home.
Obviously, the big story the big takeaway from the legislative session was the reform in public education funding. There was $6.5 billion more for public education, $5.1 billion in property tax relief. When you look at the impact that this is going to have, and what's your view on that?
These were incredible gains. I think that the legislature got accomplished. It was way overdue. And I've got to give props to my colleague, Representative Diego Bernal, for having a leadership role in that piece of legislation. I think it is a great start. One of the things we're going to have to keep in mind is how do we continue paying for that?
That's what I was going to ask you, because it's kind of a short-term sort of funding mechanism, right? And so what are your thoughts about how this is going to be able to keep this going?
Well, we have to have meaningful discussions on how we're going to pay for that. Number one, I think they looked at wanting to increase the sales tax. They wanted to do a sales tax swap. What I will say, when I talked to the leadership at the House, I said, you're going to have a tough fight because my most conservative areas of the district were not supportive of that. And so I think that was an idea that sparked and gave life in the session. So I'm pretty sure the speaker is going to do an interim committee, an interim study on that to look further into it. But I think, we really have to have a discussion meaningful in terms of other sources of revenue. What we could look at, I don't know, but I don't think we can completely depend on oil and gas for revenue.
Now, what are your thoughts about sales tax increases? I mean,
I think it's regressive. I worry about how it affects my low-income families in the district because they're going to get hit. They've got to pay for that, and so we've got to look at other ways to fund. But I don't want a situation where my low-income families, my grandmas and my grandpas, are going to be having to pay that when they're on a fixed income, as it is.
Now, do you think that there's kind of been a philosophical shift about public education in the legislature, or is this just kind of a one-off? I mean, are we past the days of massive cuts to public education, and now the discussion is about how to fund it, or are we going to backslide?
I think elections have consequences, and I think this was a big wake-up call for the leadership of the state when a number of Democrats picked up seats. Teachers were angry. Parents of children in public schools were angry. And I think, the lieutenant governor had a wake-up call. I think the governor had a wake-up call. So I think as long as we've got that group of people that continue to be vocal, this will always be at the forefront. So, you never know. Like I said, you want to look at other revenue streams, because if we end up in a situation where oil and gas doesn't do well, we're going to be back at looking at cuts again, and we don't want to have to go there.
It seems like that what happened was, the legislature basically committed itself. We're going to put this money into it, and while there's still work to be done to figure out how you're going to keep that in place, the commitment has been made, which I'm sure that's a really big part of it.
Big commitment, and this was the one session that, I can talk about the House specifically, there was no mention of vouchers this time at all.
So is that another example of elections having consequences?
Yeah, it is. Definitely.
One of the things that we've all written about a lot in recent years has been the effort by the Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick to maybe limit local control, and I don't think that went away this session. But again, and this might be a result of the 2018 election. But did it seem as though there was maybe a little less of a push on that front, or what was your sense about it?
The so-called property tax reform bill, that really was that tied the hands of urban cores. But again, my theory is you've got urban cities that are led by Democratic mayors. So I think a lot of it has to do with its politics, and it's a political fight. Back in the day, Republicans loved the fact they believed in local control. That's what they campaigned on, and now it's since flipped. And why is that? Is that because our urban cities are, the leadership are run by Democrats? And
I think that's it. Yeah.
That's what it is. That's what I believe it is.
Why do you think, it was kind of a foregone conclusion that the legislature would preempt paid sick leave policies, looking at San Antonio's paid sick leave policy and then Austin's as well. Why did that not get done?
I have a theory. Now, those bills went to Chairman Phelan, House State Affairs Committee. I have a theory. It's not a proven theory, but what I think, as you all know, Mike Basiles did a poll, and he polled on these particular issues, and it showed that they pulled very high, that there were a number of Republicans that actually supported paid sick leave policies. I personally think, and I want you to know, this is a theory. This isn't fact. We have a very smart speaker in Speaker Bonin. I think he saw those results and knew that he doesn't want to lose more Republicans next cycle. So I think that poll revealed a lot.
And I want to ask you too, you talked about elections having consequences, maybe more Republicans losing their seats. There was an interesting article in the New York Times where they talked about, this huge battle in 2020, not for president, but for state legislatures ahead of, these kind of intense redistricting battles. And the start of the article is Eric Holder, the former attorney general, saying we need to win Texas. So I'm curious on your thoughts on whether Democrats have a shot at taking the Texas House in 2020.
There's a shot, but I proceed with caution because we need to make sure, number one, we have the Democratic Party, the state party, local Democratic parties have a message, and they've got to make sure they have issues that really resonate with people. If they don't figure out what those core issues are, if they don't get engaged, then, we're not going to take those seats. We can't take it for granted and assume this blue wave is coming to Texas. I think Texas is very different. I think it's a different animal. We're not New York. We're not California. So, we have to have a game plan, and we have to have one that's effective.
Now, your district is interesting. It's kind of a mix of, you've got some low income areas and some not so low income areas, and a nice mix of politics, yes. Conservative, liberal. What would given who you represent, what would your advice be to Democrats?
Know the districts or the areas you're going to be running for. Every district is different, so your issues may be different. For me in particular, I know I have a number of active duty military that live in 124. I've got small business owners where, so it may be different from Trey Martinez Fisher's area where he really focuses on healthcare. So the issues are different. You've got to go touch those voters. You've got to go knock on those doors. You just can't rely on other people doing that for you. But you need to know what are the core issues that your constituents care about, and you got to focus on those issues.
Well, what are the core issues your
I think for me, for sure, number one was any veterans issues. Infrastructure, transportation's a big one in 124, and that includes District 6. Other areas, seniors, their health care, senior living facilities was another one. And I pulled these issues when I ran last time because I want to continue to know. I don't want to assume. I want to know, and that was one way to reach out to the voters to figure out what was important for District 124.
What's the long-term impact, do you think, in Texas of the Supreme Court decision on gerrymandering?
Well, I am on the House Redistricting Committee. This is all new ground for me, so this is going to be a learning process for me. I am concerned about the fact that they kind of washed their hands and said, hey, this is a state issue. Well, who's in leadership right now? Right. And of course, it's a ground game, and it's all about wanting to protect your seats and retaining leadership. But this is going to be eye-opening for me. So hopefully, I can get back with you all when I have a couple of hearings and let you know. We had some hearings during the session, and one of the things was talking about what's considered privileged information and what kind of computer programs are we going to be using technology in terms of drawing lines. And So this is all new ground.
Okay.
Well, I know as an attorney when you were in private practice, and also this has continued in your time in the legislature, that child abuse has been a big issue for you. Looking forward, what are your priorities on that issue? Are there any particular pieces of legislation that you think need to be passed, or that would be the next step that you would want to take on that issue?
One of the focuses, I think, that what we haven't really done is what we do in terms of prevention. Where do we put those dollars in terms of programs, cutting it off before the abuse begins and then ends up in a place that's, of course, unfortunate and detrimental. It's really trying to convince my colleagues and convincing the legislature of the importance of investing dollars in prevention, and even maybe parenting classes and getting the resources that a lot of these parents need so that they can be successful in terms of raising their children. There's so much need. And I think we've made strides, but there's so much more work to do. And again, the Child Protective Services system had been neglected for years. Mm-hmm. So it's going to take twice as long to try to fix it and come up to par.
Last month, you were part of a Texas Tribune forum at the UTSA downtown campus, and there was one thing that caught my attention, many things, but one statement by your colleague Diego Bernal on the climate change issue, because I think somebody asked about it, and he said that kind of these off-the-record sort of conversations on the floor of the House that he has with Republicans, he's starting to hear these statements like, it's getting harder for us to deny that this thing is real. And
it's funny,
I'm wondering, are you hearing some of that kind of?
You do, and I think, I guess because it was considered taboo to talk about it as a Republican, but I mean, you've got to look at what happened with Houston and the hurricane there, and we can't ignore it anymore. Now, we just have to figure out, is there the political will by leadership to create a committee, an interim committee, a committee during session to start studying climate change? We can push for it, but it's a matter of political will by leadership.
And any possibility that these off the record kinds of comments will start to that Republicans will be willing to say these things publicly?
I think there'd be a couple. Especially maybe looking in terms of those that represent the Houston area where they went through a lot of devastation. You have the Rio Grande Valley area that's gotten hit too. So if any of them want to step up and take on the cause, I'm all for it.
One of the things that I was curious about, I know that you grew up in the El Paso area on the border, and I remember last August you visited the Tornillo detention facility, and I don't think I had a chance to talk to you about what your impressions were from that experience, and just how you view the way this situation is being played out with migrant detention right now.
Yeah, so I went down. It was a Tornillo tent city that was put on federal land out there by El Paso, put up there so that they can circumvent state requirements. In terms of if you have a shelter for children, there's state requirements, but if you have it on federal land, they don't necessarily have to comply with those state requirements. When I went there, it was a very organized tour. They had everything from medical care. The one thing that really hit me was going into one of the tents and seeing, pictures that these kids would draw. And a lot of what they drew were religious symbols. They had soccer balls to play with. But they could never walk anywhere unaccompanied. They had to be with a chaperone just to go to the bathroom. I never feel that any of these places are for a kid to thrive and grow. And when I spoke with some of the administrative staff, they said, all these kids have a family member in the United States. We can get them to, but we have to rely on the FBI to do background checks on all of these family members. If they could speed up the process, we could get these kids out of here and placed with family. So that was the frustration that I felt. But what's different is these are detention centers where you have people treated very inhumanely. I don't care who you are. These are human beings that deserve basic necessities and to be cared for. And we're better than that as a country. We shouldn't be treating people or children in this way, no matter what you feel about the politics and how you feel about immigration. We as a country are better than that. And so I'm angry, I'm horrified by what I see, because we shouldn't treat any human being the way that they're being treated.
There's been a bit of a local debate here because in Tornillo, as in the new facility in Carrizo Springs that just opened last week, there are two local firms. One of them is a nonprofit, BCFS, that ran Tornillo, is now running the Carrizo Springs. And then the RK Group, the local catering firm that actually has a big contract at the convention center with the city, is providing food out there. And there's been this interesting debate between folks like Councilwoman Shirley Gonzalez, who says they shouldn't be profiting off of this endeavor, and then others who say, well, someone has to feed these kids. The profit motive is a positive force, and they do a great job. I wonder how you feel about, and I'm glad that you highlighted the point about the extended stays,
right?
Because that is a sticking point, and this is something that the Trump administration's policies, that is affecting the length of stay for these kids.
Right.
But do you see anything problematic in these local firms working down there?
You wonder. I know what the RK Group does and the importance of what they've done for the city and the jobs that they brought, but I question how much money are these organizations making and how much are they profiting? We're not talking small dollars, we're talking millions.
It was a $300 million contract.
It's a big business. And so I don't like the fact that people are profiting on misery. I understand it's a business, but you're in a fine line here. How do you justify making hundreds of millions? And your hands are getting kind of dirty there.
I was curious, how long did you live in El Paso?
All my life. I left when I was 18.
Okay.
For college.
Did you know Beto O'Rourke there at all? Or you probably met him later, I would have mentioned.
I admired Beto. So my parents, Sylvester Reyes was their congressman, and you had this new up-and-coming young guy running for Congress, the first to ever block walk my street.
Wow.
And that's when I got to know, who is this guy? I never knew him personally,
right?
But saw how hard he worked to get that office, and just stayed engaged with the community. And my parents they love the guy.
not trying to put you on the spot here, but given your El Paso roots and the fact that he's from there, and then the fact that you're a San Antonian, yeah, well, this is why I get the big bucks. But and then we've got a San Antonian, Julian Castro, running for president. I mean, are you? I'm sure you're happy to see both of them in the race, and the fact that they're representing those communities. But do you have a favorite?
Oh man, I first of all, I admire anybody running for president, sticking your neck out there. I admire several of them. Julian is one, Beto's one. Look, I like Kamala. Mm-hmm. But I think right now I'm just kind of watching. I have questions. I want to know where they are on certain issues, but I think right now I'm watching the debates just like any other person that's just wanting to know where their views are and where we agree and disagree. So I want the best candidate out there that could, take on Trump, and whoever that's going to be is who I will, of course, support.
Everyone that I've talked to about you and your time at the legislature has talked about your ability to work across the aisle and to get things done, and a sort of pragmatic approach that you have to getting. And I wondered if it's something that you came to the legislature with, or it was something that you learned on the job early. You came in the middle of a session in 2015.
I think, of course, being an attorney, I was licensed in 2000, and I've understand the importance of communicating and sitting down and negotiating, and how you can avoid bigger problems when you do that. And I think one of the biggest strengths I have, I'm quiet, but I observe a lot, and I can see, I know what particular legislator, what their strengths are. I know, I can really I look at it as like a strategic play, like Game of Thrones, and I know who the players are. But yeah, it's important. And to me, it's amazing when you can just sit down and talk with other members, and especially members across the aisle. The reality, hey, they are in leadership. And if you need to sit down and talk with them and maybe iron out some differences, that's what I'm going to do. And that's what I campaigned on when I first ran, that I was going to be effective and get things done for the district. That's my point of being there. I want to be effective and get work done.
What have you seen in terms of how the Me Too movement and increased consciousness about gender equality, has that made an impact at the legislature recently?
There are some representatives, Donna Howard out of Austin, Nicole Collier, who actually took the lead, and we didn't really have a sexual harassment policy in the House after all these years. Before Straus decided to retire, he had put together an interim committee to work on a policy. So he understood the importance of actually talking about this problem. There was a policy that was instituted, and I think Carol Alvarado, a senator out of Harris County, she passed a bill out of the Senate, and I carried it for the House, where essentially said that no money out of appropriations could be paid to settle a lawsuit against a lawmaker that's been accused of sexual harassment, but it died on the calendar. So there are attempts. This is at the forefront, but I applaud the House for instituting a policy.
Do you feel like your voice as a woman is as strong as your male counterparts?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is, and but again, I'm not afraid to use my voice. I'm not afraid to get down there and argue, and just have one-on-one conversations when need be.
So how's the House of Representatives different under Speaker Bonin than under Joe Straus?
Different styles. So Speaker Bonin was his pro temp. Joe Straus, straight statesman. When Speaker Bonin was his pro temp, he was the brawler. He was the one. He was the bad news bear. And he's still the bad news bear, but he is able to. So
what does that mean?
Like in terms of, he's not afraid to tell you no, not afraid to tell you what he thinks, and he will put his foot down when he sees bad behavior, which I like. I think this session was a little different. I think under Speaker Straus, we had some blowouts, we had some battles on the floor. It was very tempered, this session. I think because Speaker Bonin really wanted all of us to work together. He wanted us to be a united front. And he said, this is about the integrity of the House, and we're going to be a team when we need to be a team. And so this was his first session. He did very well, I thought.
Right. So does that mean that Joe Straus was too polarizing?
I don't think he was polarizing. I think he just... not polarizing. This was his agenda, and he didn't have any nonsense. But if we didn't like it, he was going to let us fight about it on the floor. Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap things up. State Representative Ina Minjarez, thank you so much for joining us. It was great having you.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
And thanks for listening, and we'll catch up with you next week. Take care.